The hum of conversation inside the merchant's table had a particular quality that evening. Low, self-satisfied, the kind of sound that only exists in rooms where people believe they have already won. The restaurant on King Street West was Toronto's quietest declaration of power. The sort of place where deals were sealed over dry-aged beef and conversations were carried in half-sentences, understood only by those who mattered. Connor Webb sat near the window, his chair angled just enough toward the room to be seen, without appearing to try. Beside him, Vanessa Cho laughed at something he said, her hand resting on his forearm in the particular way that announced ownership. He had dressed well tonight. He always dressed well now. He didn't notice the shift in the room's energy at first, but the maître did, the hostess did. Even the sommelier paused mid-pour, because walking through the front door, unhurried and composed, was Audrey Webb. The woman Connor had left in a rented basement apartment in Etobicoke with a 7-month pregnancy and a cancelled joint account. The woman he told his colleagues was too quiet for this world. The woman he had stopped calling somewhere between his third investor pitch and the moment Vanessa started returning his texts at midnight. Audrey wasn't wearing anything dramatic, a deep green wrap dress, low heels, hair pulled back simply. But it was the man beside her that made Connor's wine glass freeze halfway to his lips. Theodore Holt. The Theodore Holt, founder of Holt Capital Partners, the man whose name appeared in the same breath as infrastructure deals that shaped entire provinces. A man so private that his photograph appeared in exactly one profile piece, 4 years ago, in the Globe and Mail, and he had never spoken to a journalist since. Theodore Holt had his hand at the small of Audrey's back. Connor's glass hit the table harder than he intended. 8 months before that evening, Audrey Webb's life had looked very different. Not worse exactly, just smaller. And she had believed in that smallness, the way you believe in a structure that has held you up long enough that you stop examining its foundations. She was 38 years old, a former urban planner with the city of Mississauga, who had spent 4 years slowly stepping back from her career to support her husband's development consultancy. Connor Webb had charm, vision, and a particularly convincing ability to make the people around him feel like participants in something important. When his firm landed its first government infrastructure contract, Audrey had helped him draft the pitch. She knew the language, the zoning regulations, the community consultation requirements. She had worked those files from the inside. "You're the reason we got this," he told her then. "Over takeout pho on their kitchen floor because they couldn't afford a table yet. You know that, right?" She had believed him. She had kept believing him through the second contract, and the third, and the expansion into commercial real estate, and the moment his name started appearing in industry publications, and she stopped appearing anywhere at all. The unraveling happened the way these things usually do. Not all at once, but in a series of small, unremarkable moments that she kept explaining away. The late nights, the new wardrobe, the conference in Vancouver he'd taken alone, the way he started answering her questions with the particular tiredness of a man who has already decided the conversation isn't worth his time. Vanessa Cho had joined the firm as a communications director 14 months before Audrey found the messages. She hadn't been looking. That was the part that kept coming back to her in the weeks afterward. She hadn't gone looking. She had simply picked up Connor's phone to check the time, while hers was charging across the room, and the screen had lit up with a message so casual, so comfortable in its familiarity, that for a moment she thought it had to be a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Audrey was 10 weeks pregnant when she confronted him. She had told herself she would be calm. She had rehearsed the conversation in the shower, in the car, in the quiet early mornings when she lay awake and he slept easily beside her. But the moment he walked in and she saw his expression shift, not to guilt, not to remorse, but to something that looked almost like relief, all of it left her. "I was going to tell you," he said. She asked him what exactly he was going to tell her. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the same table she had picked out at an estate sale in Hamilton 3 years ago, and refinished herself over a long weekend. He looked at it instead of at her when he spoke. "Vanessa and I have been together for almost a year. I know this is hard, Audrey. I know. But I think we both know this stopped working a long time ago." She told him she was pregnant. There was a silence. She would remember that silence for a very long time. The particular quality of it, the way it stretched and did not fill with anything she recognized as human. "That complicates things," he said. That was the sentence. Not "I'm sorry," not "what do you need?" Just that it complicated things. He moved out 3 weeks later. By then, the joint account had been restructured. She discovered this when her card declined at a Loblaws on a Tuesday afternoon. His lawyer's letter arrived before the end of the month. Formal and precise, outlining a separation agreement that assumed she had no claim to the business she had helped build, because her name appeared nowhere on the incorporation documents. Connor had taken care of that years ago, quietly, the same way he had taken care of many things quietly. She moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Etobicoke, the kind of building with a parking garage that smelled of cold concrete and everyone's leftovers. She was 38 years old, 7 months pregnant, and going back through 4 years of her professional life, trying to understand how she had disappeared so completely inside someone else's ambition that she had left no trace of herself behind. She told herself it was temporary. Temporary had a way of calcifying. The worst part was not the loneliness, though that was considerable. It was the professional erasure. Connor's publicist, and she noted grimly that he had a publicist now, had been very effective. Audrey heard through a former colleague that the story making the rounds in their industry was that she had stepped back from urban planning voluntarily, that the marriage had simply run its course, that Connor was moving forward. The word forward appeared a great deal. She appeared very little. She applied for 3 contract positions with municipal planning departments. 2 never responded. 1 called her in for an interview, and the hiring manager, a man she had once presented alongside at an industry conference, spent most of it asking carefully neutral questions that suggested he had already heard a version of her story that she wouldn't have recognized as herself. She didn't get the contract. On a Wednesday evening in November, with the radiator in her apartment producing more noise than heat, and her prenatal vitamins running low because she had chosen groceries instead, she sat on the floor of her living room with a stack of financial documents she had finally begun to examine properly. Connor's firm had grown substantially in the past 2 years. She knew this because she had watched it happen, had been present in the room for decisions she had helped shape. What she had not fully understood until now was that her professional advice, her knowledge of City of Mississauga procurement processes, her contacts in the planning department, her understanding of which community concerns needed to be addressed in which order, had been foundational to at least 3 major contracts. Her name was on none of them, but her handwriting was in the margins of the original pitch documents, copies of which she had kept, almost by accident, in a folder on her laptop that Connor had never thought to ask about. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Mrs. Webb?" The voice was measured, unhurried. "My name is Theodore Holt. I believe you might have information I've been looking for some time." She said nothing. "I'm downstairs," he said. "I apologize for the hour. I wouldn't have come if it weren't important." She stood up slowly, hand pressed to the small of her back, and looked around her apartment as if seeing it through a stranger's eyes. The second-hand couch. The documents spread across the floor. The stack of meal planning printouts designed around a $40 weekly grocery budget. "Why would Theodore Holt be downstairs?" she said, because it seemed like the only reasonable response. "Because," he said quietly, "I made the mistake of underestimating Connor Webb 2 years ago, and I'd like to understand how." She opened the door. He was taller than the one photograph suggested. He stood in the hallway in a dark coat with snow on his shoulders, and he looked at her apartment with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't judgment. It was something more like controlled anger, though none of it was directed at her. She let him in. He sat at her kitchen table, the refinished estate sale table which she had brought with her, and he laid out what he knew without preamble. 2 years ago, Holt Capital had been positioned to partner with Connor's firm on a transit-adjacent development in Scarborough. The deal had collapsed, spectacularly, after documents were altered in a way that made Holt Capital appear to have withdrawn without cause. A junior associate at Connor's firm had been blamed. The associate had quietly left the industry. "I knew it wasn't him," Theodore said. "I didn't have proof. Connor had covered it carefully." "He's good at that," Audrey said. Theodore looked at her steadily. "What do you have?" She told him about the pitch documents, the handwritten margin notes. The emails she had sent Connor from her personal address, advising him on community consultation strategy, which he had then incorporated verbatim into the formal submissions under the firm's letterhead. She told him about the planning contacts she had introduced him to, the regulatory knowledge she had provided, the specific language around environmental assessment requirements, that she had drafted herself because Connor had come to her with a gap he couldn't fill. Theodore was quiet for a long time. "Do you understand what you're describing?" he said. "I'm describing 4 years of unpaid consulting work that no one thought to document," she said, "because I was his wife, and his wife doesn't invoice." "You're describing intellectual property," Theodore said, "and potential misrepresentation of qualifications in government submissions." She hadn't framed it that way. She had framed it as loss, as the particular grief of watching yourself become invisible. But sitting in her kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, with her laptop open and a man who could destabilize the Toronto development industry looking at her across the table, she began to understand that what she had experienced as personal devastation was, on paper, something considerably more actionable. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "The truth," he said. "Documented, thorough, chronological. And what do I get?" He met her eyes. "Your name back." The next 3 months were unlike anything Audrey had experienced. She had spent years making herself smaller, in rooms, in conversations, in her own ambitions. Learning to take up space again was not a swift or clean process. It happened in increments. Theodore brought her into a series of preliminary meetings with his legal team, and she quickly understood that her value was not simply as a witness, but as someone who understood the technical substance of what Connor had misrepresented. She could walk into a room of lawyers and planners and explain precisely where the documentation diverged from reality. She could read a government submissions file and identify, paragraph by paragraph, the language she had written. This turned out to matter enormously. The baby came in February, a girl, born at St. Joseph's Health Center on a morning when the temperature outside was -22 and the hospital corridors smelled of hand sanitizer and institutional coffee. Audrey named her Wren. She was small and insistent and entirely herself from the first moment, and Audrey sat in the hospital bed afterward, feeling simultaneously demolished and more solid than she had in years. Theodore sent flowers, tasteful ones, white tulips. She texted him a photograph of Wren's hand. By the time spring arrived, the legal process had begun in earnest. Connor's firm was under review by the Provincial Procurement Office following a formal complaint filed by Holt Capital, supported by documentation that Audrey had spent the winter assembling with a focus she surprised herself with. The documentation was precise, chronological, and difficult to dispute, because Audrey Webb had spent 4 years being meticulous about everything, while Connor had spent 4 years relying on her to be. Vanessa Cho had begun to understand that her position was less secure than she had imagined. The communications narrative she had built around Connor, the visionary entrepreneur, the industry reformer, was proving difficult to sustain when the procurement office was asking questions that touched on documents she had helped distribute. She had not created the original misrepresentations, but she had packaged them, amplified them, and in one instance sent a press release that she had known, on some level, contained a version of Connor's qualifications that did not survive scrutiny. She called Connor in late March. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "It's fine," he said. "It's not fine. They're asking about the Scarborough file. We've been through that file. It's clean. It's not clean if his ex-wife has the original drafts with her own handwriting on them." There was a silence. "She wouldn't," he said. Vanessa had learned by that point that the two most dangerous words in Connor Webb's vocabulary were "she wouldn't." He had said it about Audrey before, and before, and before that. She wouldn't push back. She wouldn't ask questions. She wouldn't keep copies. "Connor," Vanessa said carefully, "what did she keep?" He didn't answer, and his silence told her everything she needed to know about how much she had trusted someone she had never actually known. The meeting at the King Street restaurant, Connor's preferred venue for anything he considered celebratory, had been arranged to mark a new partnership he believed was still intact. He had not yet understood that the partnership had been quietly withdrawn 24 hours earlier, following a call between the partner's legal team and Holt Capital. He was, in other words, celebrating something that no longer existed. Audrey had not planned to be there. She had come because Theodore had a dinner reservation he'd held for weeks, and he had asked her simply whether she felt ready. She had looked at Wren, then 3 months old and asleep in a sling against her chest, and said she thought she was. She left Wren with her neighbor for the evening. She walked into the merchant's table in a green wrap dress and low heels, and she did not look for Connor until she was already through the door. He saw her first. She felt it before she found his face. A change in the room's atmosphere, a collective pause, the kind that happens when something unexpected has entered a space designed entirely around the expected. When her eyes found his, she didn't smile. She simply held his gaze for a moment, steady and unhurried, the way you look at something that once had power over you and no longer does. Then she turned toward her table. Connor's chair scraped back. He was on his feet before he thought about what he was doing, crossing the room in the way that people do when fear outpaces judgment. "Audrey," his voice came out wrong, too urgent, too low. "We need to talk." She stopped. She turned around. "This isn't the place," she said. "I don't care about the place." He stepped closer. He was aware of Theodore Holt, standing a short distance away, watching, saying nothing. "Whatever you've told him, whatever documents you think you have." "I don't think I have them, Connor. I have them." He lowered his voice further. "You're going to destroy everything I've built. Do you understand that? Everything." Audrey looked at him. The man who had sat across from her, at the kitchen table she'd refinished herself, and told her, without quite saying the words, that her pregnancy complicated things. The man who had watched her retreat from her profession, her ambitions, her sense of her own usefulness, and had never once said that anything had been lost. "You built it on my work," she said, "and you didn't think I'd notice, because you'd spent 4 years teaching me not to." Connor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Excuse me," Audrey said. "I have dinner plans." The provincial procurement review concluded 6 weeks later. The findings were specific and unflattering. Misrepresentation of technical expertise in 3 government submissions, improper attribution of planning knowledge, and, most significantly, the Scarborough document alteration that had been used to deflect responsibility onto Theodore Holt's junior associate 2 years earlier. Connor Webb's firm lost its standing with the provincial procurement office. 2 contracts currently in delivery were placed under third-party administration. His professional membership was under review. The junior associate, a man named Daniel Park, who had spent 2 years doing freelance drafting work because no firm in the industry would hire him, was formally exonerated. Vanessa's position unraveled in a different way, more public and more personal. The communications work she had done for Connor had left a paper trail that suggested, at minimum, that she had curated a professional narrative she had reason to doubt. 3 of her existing clients, a property developer, a provincial candidates campaign, a tech startup, ended their contracts within the same week. The 4th called to ask if the reports were accurate. She sat in her apartment on a Friday night, scrolling through her phone, reading things about herself that had been written by people who had never met her, and she tried to locate the moment she had made the choice that led here. She found, to her discomfort, that she could not identify a single dramatic turning point. It had been a series of small allowances, each one reasonable in isolation. Assembled together, they had produced a life she didn't recognize. She tried calling Connor twice. He didn't answer. His lawyer sent her a brief email noting that given the ongoing professional proceedings, Mr. Webb was limiting all communication to matters handled through legal counsel. She put her phone face down on the counter and sat very still for a long time. Audrey moved into a 2-bedroom unit in a building near High Park in April. It was still modest, still careful, still nothing like the life she had shared with Connor. But it had afternoon light through the south-facing windows, and a small balcony where she could put a chair, and a 2nd bedroom where she set up a crib and a rocking chair and a shelf for the board books she had already started collecting. Theodore came for dinner one evening, the first time he had been to her home in this new form of her life. He brought wine he'd thought she'd like, and did the dishes without being asked, and they sat on the small balcony after Wren was asleep, and talked about things that had nothing to do with Connor or Holt Capital or provincial procurement processes. At some point the conversation stilled, and he said, "I owe you an honest accounting." She waited. "When I first came to you," he said, I came because I needed what you knew, not because of you specifically. I had identified that Connor's former wife had municipal planning expertise, and I calculated that she might have documentation I couldn't get anywhere else. She had suspected as much. And now, he was quiet a moment. Now I'm sitting on a $12 balcony chair in High Park because I'd rather be here than anywhere else I could be tonight. She looked at him sideways. $12? I saw the tag still on it. She laughed. It was an unexpected sound, and it surprised both of them, and it didn't stop for a little while. You should have told me earlier, she said, when it settled. Yes, he said. I know. I'm telling you now because you deserve the full version, not the version that flatters me. She thought about that. She thought about the difference between a man who managed her and a man who leveled with her. She thought about how unfamiliar the second kind had felt at first, and how much less unfamiliar it felt now. I appreciate that, she said. He nodded. They watched the lights in the park below for a while, and the city moved around them the way it always does. Indifferent and enormous and somehow still navigable, if you knew which way you were going. The professional formal notification arrived in May. Holt Capital Partners was establishing a new urban planning advisory division with a focus on transit-oriented development and municipal infrastructure projects in Ontario and Quebec. Audrey Webb was named as its director. Not consultant, not advisor, director. Her name, her credentials, her specific expertise. In print, on the company's website, in the press release distributed to the same industry contacts who had spent the past year hearing a version of her story she hadn't written. Several of those contacts reached out directly. Some were surprised. A few were apologetic in a careful way that told her they had known, on some level, that something hadn't added up. One former colleague sent a message that simply said, I should have called sooner, I'm sorry. She replied to all of them. Daniel Park sent a longer message, thanking her. She called him instead of replying. They talked for an hour about the Scarborough project, the real version of it, the one she remembered, and by the end of the conversation she had offered him a contract, and he had accepted, and neither of them mentioned Connor's name again. The day she signed her employment agreement at Holt Capital's offices on Bay Street, she took the long way back to the parking garage so she could walk past the building where she had spent 4 years as Connor's silent infrastructure. The lobby was being renovated. There was a notice in the window about a change of management. She stood outside for a moment. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly. What she felt was clearer, the particular quietness of a decision you didn't know you had made until you were already living inside it. The decision to stop making yourself small. The decision, and this one was harder, to recognize that being made small by someone you loved was not the same as being small. She had confused those two things for a long time. She walked to her car. Ren was at home with a neighbor, and the afternoon light was doing something particular to the lake visible at the end of the cross streets, and the city was moving forward the way it always does, carrying everyone in it somewhere whether they intended it or not. She had intended it now. Later that year, on a Saturday in October when the maples along Roncesvalles had gone the color of good Scotch, and the air had the clean cold bite of a Canadian fall beginning in earnest. Audrey Webb stood in the light of her own living room and let herself be glad. Ren was crawling now, deliberate and delighted, pulling herself along the floor toward whatever caught her attention. Theodore sat cross-legged a few feet away, extending a wooden ring, and Ren regarded it with the absolute seriousness of someone for whom all information is new and worth considering. Audrey watched them both from the kitchen doorway. She thought about Connor's sentence, that it complicated things, and how long she had carried it, and how little it weighed now. She thought about the woman who had sat on an apartment floor in Etobicoke with an eviction warning and a prenatal vitamin bottle, and had answered a call from an unknown number because something in her gut said to. That woman had known more than she'd been given credit for. She always had.